One of the options available to you when working with AWS S3 is the option to configure static website hosting. So in this bucket that I've enabled static website hosting, and you'll notice that it's my domain name, brianwitkowski.com. So under properties, and then I'm scrolling down to the bottom of the page. There's basically a flag to enable or disable static website hosting, and you'll notice that it's asking for a couple of things like what's the index document and what are the error documents, and that has to do with rendering a default page, and then also what happens when there's an HTTP error condition, and it'll render that error document. Okay, but what I want to focus on in this video is what does it actually mean for static website hosting? And I've created a graphic for discussion, and I'm going to jump over to that graphic. And the basics of server-side programming. So we're talking about static website hosting, but this little graphic is server-side programming. So what's going to happen is you as an end user, or maybe you as a developer, depending on which role you're taking on, but basically the way an HTTP request works is that some client, so whether it's a phone or a laptop, but some client browser is going to type in a URL in an address bar, and what that's going to do is it's going to make an HTTP GET request. Okay, so that's this process right here that I'm kind of focused on. And in our AWS case, what happens is that request gets routed to our S3 bucket. Okay, you'll notice that I have some additional work going on down here below the server, but then ultimately what happens is I get a server response. Okay, so to kind of talk about server-side programming first, what happens is the client makes a request, it ends up at my server. My server has to be configured to handle a web request, so I have to have a operating system, and then I'm making that request on either port 80 for HTTP or 443 for HTTPS. The server sees that, and if I have corresponding web server software installed on my server, so Apache or IIS, what'll happen is when it sees that request, your web server will actually get involved and say, hey, that's my responsibility, I'm going to take care of that request. So if your client makes a request to the server, you have your web server software running in the background like a service, essentially, and it sees that requests come in on port 80 or 443, and it first says, okay, what are you actually asking for? Okay, so just to kind of keep things simple, let's say they're asking for an HTML page. Okay, so if they're asking for an HTML page, what happens is that web server goes to the file system, reads the HTML page, and then sends the server response back to the client's browser, and the browser understands HTML, CSS, Java, JavaScript, images, etc. Okay, that's kind of a basic request. So client says, I want an HTML page, gets routed to the server, your web server software gets involved, reads the HTML file, sends a server response. We never get down into this section of actually processing. Okay, so we've bypassed server-side programming. Okay, where server-side programming comes into play is, let's say the client makes a request, and this time, instead of asking for an HTML file, they ask for a web page that's written in PHP or Java or .NET or Python or Ruby, any of those various programming languages. So they make the request. It's not HTML, it's not JavaScript, it's not something, and the way you can kind of distinguish this, the easy test is, does your browser support, like if I were to open that file in my browser, does my browser understand that file? Okay, does a browser understand Java? And the answer is no. Java has to be compiled and then run through a Java virtual machine. Same for .NET, same for Python, same for Ruby, same for PHP. Okay, so your browser is not going to understand those programming languages. Browser only understands HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, maybe XML, things like that. Okay, so if your browser doesn't understand it and you make a request for that file, then there's an additional process of the web server is not just going to read the file off the file system and send it back to the client. What's going to happen is the web server is going to get involved and say, oh, I know that a browser doesn't understand what they're asking for. Let me go ahead and process that file. Okay, so the request needs to execute code on the server. Okay, so what happens is, because you've asked for a Ruby file, you've made the request, your client has made the request for a Ruby file, then the server has to do some processing on that request before it actually sends the response. Okay? Same if your client asks for a Java file. Right? So if you ask for a Java file, the request is going to end up at the server the same way your request would end up at the server if you ask for an HTML file. But in this case, since you're asking for a Java file, there's going to be an additional step that happens. So your server, your web server, is going to say, oh, you're asking for a Java file. Let's go ahead and execute that Java code so that we can generate a server response that the client will actually understand. Okay, so if your request, so if the client request is asking for a file that it can ultimately understand, then it's just a simple matter of the web server reads the file off the file system and sends the response back. However, if the client's asking for something that it wouldn't normally be able to interpret, like Java, .NET, PHP, Ruby, Python, the list goes on. So if your client asks for one of those files, what happens is it gets to the server and the web server says, oh, some additional processing needs to occur. I can't just send the raw file back. I actually have to process the file. That's what server-side programming is. That the web server is saying, I have to process the file before I send the server response. Okay, so all of this is a long way of getting to the fact that when we enable static website hosting, what we're really talking about is, am I actually executing this server-side process? Right? If I'm executing that server-side code, then it's not a static website. However, if the client's requesting HTML or CSS or JavaScript or images, the only thing the web server has to do is read the file, grab the contents of the file, and send it back. It's static. Whatever that file looked like on the file system doesn't need to be executed. It just needs to be read, and the static contents of that file then get sent as the server response. So what really is happening is we're cutting out this server processing. That's the difference between a static website and a non-static website, is does that server-side programming actually need to occur? And if I'm talking about a whole website, maybe some of the website is static, but some of it where I have to actually execute code is written in Java, then I would consider that a non-static website. But if I know the whole website is HTML and CSS and JavaScript and images, if I know that, then I know that the browser can handle all of those files. So if my entire project is written in those formats, then I know that I have a static website because I don't have to run server-side code in order to send the response back to the client, and the client's still going to be able to interpret those files.